This loop is characterized by an eerie red light and what appears to be a hanging refrigerator. I'll start with the fridge. The obvious implication is that the murderer stored one or more of his victims within it. I think this is the most likely explanation. Some theorists have suggested the fridge represents the murderer's alcoholism, but a quick glance up and down the hallway reveals that he had a penchant for liquor or wine, neither of which is typically stored in a refrigerated environment. In the next loop, we hear a baby's cries coming from inside the fridge. The fringe might symbolically reflect the fact that the fetus has been frozen in time or something, but between the radio report and the undeveloped fetus in the sink, I don't think we needed any more assurance of the fact that a baby was aborted. I'm not especially fond of symbolic readings. The conversion of hello to hell represents at worst a sort of pun a person might find clever if English was not his first language, and at best a fun puzzle with the implication that the graffiti artist hears them calling from hell via the telephone. And in fact, that's possibly where the final phone call comes from. In just a moment, I'll interrupt the playthrough to show footage of myself getting the ghost to appear in this loop. Simply waiting around long enough for a haunting to start will do it. While we wait, I'll discuss the red light. I know this sort of explanation is deeply unsatisfying, but changing the colour of the light is a natural step towards further removing this hallway from a standard unthreatening hallway. It might be said that this teaser's greatest attribute is its pacing after all. Why the colour red? Because there is no other colour loaded with so many negative connotations, except perhaps black, but a black light may have looked too unnatural. If I had to make two interpretations, one would be that the red light gives the hallway the look of a dark room, such as that used to process photography. This leads to the assumption that the murderer may have been a photographer, that he may have been spying on his wife, or that this hallway has been captured to be experienced over and over again, just like a memory in a photograph. It's worth noting that there's a camera hiding on the same cabinet as the phone. The second interpretation would be that we're heading towards hell. The red light's appearance coincides with the graffiti's allusion to hell. It's also interesting to note that we descend a short series of steps in every loop. We never ascend any. This means that with every loop we're effectively moving deeper. The developers may have included the stairs to keep the separate hallways from colliding with one another, but there are other technical methods to prevent that, so I suspect they wanted players to be aware of the descent. As video games grow more and more expensive to produce, it's becoming rarer and rarer for developers to work on anything that might not be seen by most gamers, and that's why I'm particularly impressed that they've gone to the effort of including this type of randomized encounter with the ghost. I suspect it would have taken more effort to develop the walking version of the ghost than it would have the balcony or the jumpscare ghost, and yet of the three it's potentially the least likely to be seen. I did not encounter it myself before the internet told me I could, but that may be because I was too afraid to look at anything whenever a haunting began. I'm not entirely sure why the ghost's upper torso moves so erratically. It may have something to do with the way the ghost was murdered, which would support a theory I'll explain later, or it may simply be because she's a spirit, and as such she's wont to move strangely and unlike the living. Take note of the blood on her gown. From this we can surmise that the fetus was cut out of her. The radio's monologue warns us in Swedish that aliens are walking amongst us. The broadcast is in Swedish because PewDiePie is Swedish, and he is an endorsement so irresistible that some developers would do anything to get his attention. As to the aliens, extraterrestrials have made several appearances in the Silent Hill franchise. Thus, think of this as sort of an in-joke, serving to hint at the teaser's relationship with Silent Hill. Bear in mind that at this point in the teaser, no one would have known that this is a teaser for Silent Hills. Otherwise, the talk of aliens, coupled with the earlier radio message insisting that we shouldn't trust the tap water, evokes a sense of tinfoil hat paranoia, possibly to reflect the murderer's own paranoia regarding his wife's sexual liaisons. Or it is intended to mirror the obsessive video game conjecture tossed back and forth by nerds on the internet. You may wonder why the player is suddenly able to run in this section. The real answer is that the developers wanted the player to traverse an infinite hallway without succumbing to tedium. The fake and profound answer is that the protagonist is suffering the same drunken, desperate haze the murderer did when he decided to kill his wife, hence the blurred vision. The eyes in the photograph probably represent the ghost's missing eye. Maybe the killer gouged it out because he couldn't bear the reproving looks given to him by his wife for his alcoholism, and now she judges him eternally with that same eye for his cruel killing. The peephole is situated to observe almost the entire bathroom. Some have theorized that it was by looking through this peephole that the murderer discovered his wife's pregnancy. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but the size of the peephole is absurdly big. There's no way the wife wouldn't have seen it. So either she knew about it, or the peephole is merely meant to be representative of the killer's mistrust towards his wife. Peering into the peephole, we hear the radio broadcasted ostensibly inside of the murderer to action. Inside we can hear a woman being butchered. The woman is clearly still alive, and we do not hear any gunshots, leading me to believe that the murders reported via the radio broadcast are separate to the one that happened in this home. It's possible instead that the murderer was listening to reports of men killing families and used them as inspiration. It's also possible that the radio broadcast we hear is live, whereas the events that occurred in this house and hallway happened months ago, which tell us that these killings are still taking place. A new message is waiting for us once we finish listening to the audio. It could be taken figuratively, a final taunting reminder of the consequences of familicide. It's usually not a process that can be reverted after all. Or the message can be taken literally. If we attempt to backtrack here, we'll run into a dead end. This wall was no doubt erected to prevent the player from making a slow and fruitless journey back through the very long hallway. It also serves to demonstrate more deliberately than the eternally closed hallway entrance that the protagonist is completely unable to retreat or escape from this psychological or supernatural labyrinth in which he's found himself trapped. Inside the bathroom, we find that the fetus has suddenly grown very talkative. His use of the second person here is a little confusing since we can see the perspective character's face in the mirror and it does not resemble the male from the hallway photographs. Perhaps it's simply a stylistic choice, or the fetus has the protagonist confused with the murderer, or there's something even stranger going on. The fetus, curiously speaking in the same voice as the radio host, and possibly the paper bag as well, pointedly hints that the murderer's wife was impregnated by her boss. Whether this is true or not is unclear, but it was certainly what the murderer believed. It's entirely likely that the fetus, or the radio host, or the talking bag, or whomever this voice belongs to is far less benevolent than I proposed in my earlier video. Perhaps this voice whispered into the murderer's ear until he believed his wife was adulterous, and perhaps the looping hallway is the voice's way of whispering into the protagonist's ear as well. "The only me is me," says the voice, but you, the protagonist, are only the latest in a long line of copycat killers. I would like to say that we're actually experiencing the hallway through the ghost's eyes, particularly because, as LazyMan9000 shrewdly observed in the comment section of my last video, the bathroom is at its most unthreatening here. If we take it for granted that the bathroom is perhaps the ghost's sanctuary or point of anchorage because it's where she was murdered, it might suggest we're seeing the bathroom as the ghost sees it. However, as attractive as this theory is, I'm inclined to reject it because we don't hear the ghost's heel as we run, and looking in the mirror reveals only Norman Reedus' face. We're approaching the scripted client crash. I'm not sure if the developers actually meant to fool players into thinking that this was really a bug, but for many people this instead seemed to indicate the end of the teaser. I'm not usually a fan of metafiction because too many people seem unaware that literary self-awareness isn't new or novel, and hasn't been for decades. Creators seem mostly content to include aspects of metafiction in lazy and uninteresting ways, deluded that the old gimmick is still gimmicky enough to justify its own inclusion. However, Kojima's implementation of metafiction has often been fairly inventive, and there's no denying how creepy it could be to play a horror game that knows you're playing it. As we wait for the game to crash, I'll discuss the two numbers that have fueled pages and pages of online speculation. 7780, the name of the make-believe developer behind PT, and 204863, the number spoken over and over again throughout. Warning, you won't like what I have to say about them. Everyone knows by now that 7780 is the measurement in square meters of a prefecture in Japan called Shizuoka, and that Silent Hill translated into Japanese sounds a lot like Shizuoka. Hence, 7780S literally means Silent Hill S. Everyone has also heard that 204863 is a number fairly close to Kojima's date of birth. And yet, the internet has remained hell-bent on discovering additional explanations behind these numbers, seemingly validated by the anomalous 0, which does not fit into Kojima's date of birth. I am of the belief that these numbers have no additional meaning. We've known that PT is a teaser for Silent Hills for so long now, we find it difficult to remember that it first entered our minds as a brand new title from a brand new developer. We can't forget that Kojima envisioned the teaser to stump people for at least a week. During that week, before we were supposed to know what PT was, those numbers would have held a secret for us. They were meant to be clues that hinted at the teaser's actual purpose. Therefore, as tempting as some theories may be, I don't think there is any story information we can glean from either of these two numbers. On the other hand, I'm less certain whether or not the numbers hold any gameplay clues. There is a fantastic video by The Great Debate, which I'll link in the description below, that treats the numbers as codes to be solved. The work that went into decrypting the codes is very impressive, but I don't think it actually solves any puzzles, particularly because I'm not convinced a puzzle is there. How do I explain the extra 0 then? Well, it could be taken as the second half of the number 20, as in 20. Also note that since there are only 12 months in a year, the date can't really be mistaken for any other date, even with the extra 0. Kojima seems to me like the sort of guy who'd spend time googling his own date of birth, and it's possible he came across the popular Trichocarpa, the gene model of which is 204863, and appreciated the coincidence. It's also possible the 0 was simply there to throw people off. He's pulled a similar trick before. In Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, it is rumoured that God is being held hostage in one of the trucks. God turns out to be Hideo Kojima, making a cameo in his own game. The truck's license plate is 63824. He is referred to as God, perhaps because he's more than a little egotistical, but also because in the world of Metal Gear, a world that he created, he is God. You get the joke. And yet, would a person who thinks like that also think of himself as God in the context of a horror game? Or would he be more likely to think of himself as, oh, I don't know, the man downstairs, the man on the other end of the line, if you will?
You've been chosen.
Again, thank you very much for watching. I apologise that I've had to split this into 3 videos, but they really are taking me a long time to put together. The next will definitely be the last. In the final video, I'll look at the final puzzle and go back over some of the things from earlier in the teaser I missed. If there are aspects of the teaser you're worried I won't cover, please voice them in the comments section and I'll do my best to get to them.